All right. Welcome, everyone. My name's Holly Seeliger, and I'm chair of the Policy and Public Affairs Committee meeting. And we are holding our first Portland Board of Education Public Affairs Community Forum. So welcome community members, parents, family, administration, and board members are here to answer questions. And we're going to have a presentation by our Superintendent, Botana, on funding for our future. So take it away.
Thank you, Madam Seeliger. We also have the Chief Financial Officer, Executive Director for Finance and Budget, Alicia Gardner, who is with me today. Our goal is to explain the building blocks for education funding in Maine and in Portland in particular. Touching on the funding streams, what does the money get used for, and also begin to sort of frame it in a broader context in comparison to our neighbors and things along those lines. And then really what this is intended, since this is a forum from the Public Affairs Committee, is really it's an opportunity to get public input into our budget process as we kick it off. So this is intended to be the beginning of an ongoing dialogue with the community over the next month or so as we go forward building our budget. So I'm very grateful to everyone from the community that's here. I see State Representative Talbot Ross, thank you for being here. We will be talking badly about you and your colleagues at some points during the presentation today. Not really, but we will be pointing out to some of the concerns that we have with the current funding provided by the state. And so then we will obviously answer any questions as part of the public input session. So with that, I want to start by grounding everyone in the work that we are doing in the Portland Public Schools. Every morning that I wake up, I am grateful for the opportunity to work and lead this amazing school district. When I say that great things happen at PPS, I know that everybody in this room is familiar with our story, knows the tremendous amount of learning that happens in Portland Public Schools every day, and that is inspirational, and the reason that all of the people, the 1,000 plus people that work in the Portland Public Schools come to work every morning, and I know it's the reason why the board does the work that it does, and that all of you are here today because you understand that and care about the work that we're doing in the Portland Public Schools. Over the last year, we built our new comprehensive plan, the Portland Promise, which is our commitment as a school district to deliver on 4 goals that were jointly arrived at obviously with the Board of Education, ultimately approved and endorsed, and is holding me and itself accountable to our achieving of those goals, and involved a very intensive process with our faculty and staff and with our community to arrive at those 4 goals. The 4 goals very quickly are achievement, whole student, equity, and people. Our achievement goal is that 92% of our students will graduate from high school in the 5 years out. Will graduate from high school prepared and empowered. And in the process of sort of crafting that terminology of prepared and empowered, that has also become the way that we describe what we do as a school district. Prepared and empowered. Prepared represents the fact that our kids have the knowledge and skills, and empowered represents that it's also our job to make sure they know when they leave us what it is that they intend to do with the knowledge and skills that they've built over the years. Whole student is our goal that recognizes that as a school district we do more than teach content, that we also are preparing students to be citizens, are preparing students to be whole students, that we need to attend to their social emotional development, their habits of mind, their dispositions, and that is the work that we do. And many of our resources in the school system are dedicated to building those relationships, to understanding all of our students' experiences and building on those and supporting those experiences. Equity is our recognition that as a school system, we do a very good job with many of our students, and that at the same time we are only as good as our weakest link. And the fact that when we look across the board and see that the performance, the experience of our students whose first language is not English, our students who come from economic disadvantage, our students of color, our students who are English is not their first language. We know that we've got to do better in that area, and so our equity goal specifically calls out the fact that we will reduce those gaps in both achievement but also in opportunity by 50% over the next 10 years, and that's modeled after, that goal in particular is modeled after the state ESSA plan, their Title I plan, so that's how we arrived at that particular target. And then the last but not least goal is our people goal, and that is at the bottom for a reason, because it is what undergirds our ability to deliver on those other goals. And that goal speaks to the fact that we're only as good as the people that are working for us. And so we have to, as a school system, be dedicated to making sure that we have the most talented and diverse group of staff, and that those individuals understand what they're doing, why they're doing it, and they have the support that they need to be able to accomplish their goals. And so that's our Portland promise, and we know that Portland is an amazing school system, and we know that we can achieve those goals and more, and the building block of being able to do that is our budget, and that's why this conversation with our community is critical, because we need to be able to help our community understand what it is that goes into a budget, what does the budget support, and what everybody needs to do to be able to help us to continue to provide the quality of education that makes great things happen at PPS. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Alicia to talk about Budget 101.
All right, so thanks everyone for coming today, and hopefully we have some friends joining us online as well. So we're going to talk about what is a school budget. So a school budget is what it costs to educate students. The Portland Public Schools budget covers a one-year period between July 1st and June 30th. 75 to 80% of school budgets are made up of the salaries and benefits of the people who make education possible. The remaining 20 to 25% is often impacted by state, local, and federal mandates that relate to everything from building codes to class size. The school budget provides Portland Public Schools with the opportunity to justify the collection and expenditure of public funds. And our school budget helps us describe our plan for the upcoming year and helps bridge the gap that can exist between our stated goals, so the Portland Promise, and the resources that we have to work with. So the budget process forces us to have a discussion about what choices we'll make, and that we realize, and hope that everyone else realizes, that these choices are competing for limited available resources. So we're going to talk about the three revenues that make up the school budget and how do we pay for it. So here in Portland, 81.8% of the total budget is paid for by the Portland property taxes. 15.6% was paid for by state education subsidy, and we have about 2.5% coming from other sources, and this is for the current year's 2018 budget that we're talking about right now. So the first revenue source is probably the most complicated to understand, so we're going to make an effort to talk about it on a very high level. So the factors that are considered when we're talking about the state budget is the state determines what the minimum baseline for education is. And to do that, they take the number of students that Portland Public Schools has, they take the number of teachers and administrators and clerical staff, and they come up with a formula that determines how much money we're going to get for our K-8 students and our 9-12 students. So there's sort of two buckets of money here. They then apply that number to the actual number of students we have and come out with sort of a base allocation. And then they give us some targeted funds for things like our limited English proficiency. We have targeted funds for economically disadvantaged students. We have targeted funds for pre-K and K2. Those are new in the current year. And then we have some other things that they put in the pot. So there's special education subsidy that we get money for. We get money for transportation. We get money for gifted and talented students. We get the reimbursement from the state on the debt service for locally funded schools. So for our Hall School coming up this year is going to be the first year that we will have that debt service payment, and that's something that the state sponsored, and they will reimburse the city of Portland for that expense. And then finally, in the upcoming year, career and technical education is sort of the last piece of that total bucket. So we take all those numbers and we get to what the minimum baseline education is for Portland. And then we go to the second piece where the state's determining what the local community will contribute on to that total baseline budget based on its wealth. And when we say based on its wealth, the way that they determine that is based on the value of the city of Portland over a 2-year period of time. So in the upcoming year, our value will be determined on 2016 and 2017. And they multiply that amount by essentially a mill rate. The same way that we figure out our local taxes is the same way that the state's figuring out what the required local share will be. So for last year, just to give you an idea of how these work, the minimum baseline education number was approximately 80 million and the required local share was 63 million. So the difference between the two is the amount that we receive in education subsidy. So that's the first of the revenues. The next revenue sources are sort of our all other numbers. So our first is federal money. We get funds from the federal government for things like food service and for some targeted allocations and things like Medicaid that our special education students, sometimes we're able to bill for that. The next piece is very small, but we sometimes rent out our buildings so people can rent the gym at Deering or an elementary school to have a community fundraiser. And the next is athletic gate receipts. So the amount that you pay to get into a basketball game or a football game goes to help our budget to bring the total tax dollar down. And then there's interest on investments, and as we probably all know, that's pretty much non-existent at this point. The interest rates are very low. And the final amount is tuition. So that's amounts that students from outside of Portland, if they don't have an agreement between superintendents that their parents are paying for them to come be a student at Portland Public Schools. So all those amounts together are our second revenue. And then the third piece we figure out by taking our total budget, so all of the salaries and benefits and everything that we know we have to pay for next year, and then we subtract out our two revenue sources. So we take out the state education subsidy and we take out the other revenues. And that total amount we are left with is the Portland property taxes. So that's our third revenue. So the Portland property tax is, sorry, I'm behind. Okay, so each town or city in Maine assesses, bills, and collects property taxes for the community and offer varying services in each community. Portland is known by a full-service city, so that basically means the city of Portland provides almost all the services that the citizens of Portland need in order to maintain a great quality of life. So everyone who owns Portland property pays a part of their tax bill for education. So they're paying for pre-kindergarten through 12th grade education, and they're paying for adult education. And this is regardless of whether they have students in the system. And this is often a question that we receive. And we try to explain it in the same way that you pay your city portion of the tax bill. So you're helping pay for police and fire and street maintenance, even though you may not use all those services during the year. But in order to know that you could use them, this is why we pay our tax bill. So, go ahead. The way that property taxes are figured are very similar to the way the state education subsidy is decided. Houses or businesses with a higher property value pay a higher amount in property taxes. And conversely, houses or businesses with a lower property value pay a lower amount in property taxes. So Portland's valuation is rising, as you can see here. So this is the valuation as determined by the state. So in 2016, we were at 7.7 billion. In 2016, 2017, we were at 8 billion. 2018, we're at 8.5. In 2019, so for fiscal year 2019, we're at $9 billion. So we can see that it's climbing, and in the state's view, the city of Portland is able to take on a higher share of the total cost of education because we have a higher capacity to pay for these services locally. And as I mentioned before, they essentially take 2 years and get the average to see sort of how the state education subsidy is going to be assessed. So not only in the current year where we're talking about 2016 and 17, but as you can see, next year for 2017 and 2018, and the year after for 2018 and 2019, this amount is going to continue to rise. So we anticipate that the shift to the local requirement is going to continue to shift over to the city of Portland. So there will be a larger burden on the second and third revenues to pay a larger proportion of the budget as we move forward. So let's talk about what it pays for. So now that we have this understanding, go ahead, you can click all 4 of them. So the major expenses are salaries and benefits, like we already talked about, and they represent about 80%. And the other 20% is made up of all these other categories. So there's a whole section we can't see. Can you hit it one more time? There you go. So we have supplies. So we're paying for office supplies and books and software fees and custodial fees or supplies. And then we have contracted services. So this is where we're bringing in a third party to help us out at the Portland Public Schools. We have repairs and maintenance. We have legal fees. So our lawyers are helping us draft policies and ensuring that we're following the state rules and the city rules that we need to follow. And then we have professional development for our teachers and our principals and our central office staff. And finally, we have sort of the facility expenses. So we have a lot of school buildings. So we need to keep them up with maintenance and utilities. We have our food service department, so they have a big expense, and that's food. And then finally, we have the debt service, like we talked about before. So all of the debt service that we borrow for our school construction and sort of our annual capital improvement program is all located in our budget. So, and then the offsetting revenue that we talked about earlier from the state sort of pays us back for the amounts that we're paying for. So those are our major expense categories. And finally, go back one more. Yes.
So briefly, as I said at the beginning, we are now entering the process of building a school budget. So that is a process that involves the entire community, and that's why we start with today's meeting here. The work doesn't start today, as we've been doing work leading up to this. So over the past couple of months, as we've been preparing for this, we've been looking at our enrollment, we've been engaging with our school leaders, with our stakeholders to understand what it is that we need for the coming year. We've also looked at our existing contracts and purchases and things along those lines to project what the escalated costs of those will be. And that process is ongoing now, leading to the presentation of a budget, which I'm scheduled to do on March 6th for the Portland Board of Education. So that will be the formal introduction of my budget to the school board on March 6th. Subsequent to that, the school board will bring that budget to the city council. We'll meet twice with the city council prior to it actually being voted on by the board for adoption. And then once it's adopted by the school board, it will go to the city council, and it will go through, again, a process at the city council level before it is advanced. I just want to underscore that throughout that process, there are opportunities for public engagement. The board will hold 2 public hearings on the budget at different points during their committee structure, and the city will do the same during its finance committee structure, and then subsequently when it goes before the council for approval. And then in Maine, we have a very special aspect to this, which many of you are familiar with, which is the idea that ultimately the taxpayers in this community are the ones that ultimately approve the budget. So after it goes through all of those steps that I described in the previous slide, we will still bring that to the voters of Portland to make a determination on whether that budget is one that they believe meets the needs of the community for the upcoming year.
I'm going to talk a little bit about how Portland compares to our neighbors, because I think sometimes it's hard to conceptualize a $100 million budget, because Portland is much larger than our neighbors, and it's a little bit difficult to say, well, you know, Cape Elizabeth's budget's only $25 million. How come they can do it with that amount? So this chart shows all of our neighbors, sort of in this very close region, the number of students, their total budget for 2018, the percent of their budget that the state pays for. So that's that state education subsidy that we talked about, that for us is 14.15%. And then we do, so we take the total budget and we divide that by the number of students, because that really gets down to an indicator that really is an apples to apples comparison to all of our neighbors. So that shows how much money each district is spending per student. And then the final column is the school tax rate. So that's the portion of your tax bill for each of these communities that is allocated to K-12 education. So as you can see, we have Falmouth, South Portland, Scarborough, Cape Elizabeth, Portland, and Westbrook. And of course, we have the most students by far, about 6,700 students. As I mentioned, our budget last year was about $100 million, and the state pays about 14.15% of our budget. So it's interesting to look at our neighbors. So as we know, a lot of this is developed by valuation. So for Falmouth, the state pays about 22%. For Portland, they're paying 12%. For Scarborough, they're paying less than 5%. For Cape, they pay about 7%. And then for Westbrook, they're at about 41%. So again, this is based on the number of students and the valuation for those communities. But let's take a look at the spending per pupil and the tax rate, because I really think this is where we can see that Portland's doing a great job. So compared to all of our neighbors, we are the second lowest in the spending per pupil. So even though that $100 million looks like a lot of money, divided by our number of students, for all of our neighbors, we're the second lowest. So Falmouth is at the very top, spending $17,000 per student. South Portland at $16,000, Scarborough just about the same as South Portland, Cape at $15,500, and then Westbrook is just under us at $14,393. So the per pupil amount, we're really trying to use our resources wisely. We're not, there's not a lot extra that we have asked for as part of this budget. And I do want to note that we've done this calculation and we've looked at our budget and said, what does our budget look like if we're spending what these other communities are spending? So just for an example, if we were spending what Falmouth is spending, our budget would be about $120 million. So just to put that in context for you. And then finally, the tax rate. So this again is the portion that is allocated towards just the schools in our budget. And again, we are the second lowest tax rate. So I think that Portland compares favorably to our neighbors, and I think that we can say that we're offering, the wide array of things that these other districts are offering. So Xavier is going to finish us out.
And so the key takeaway that we want to be the basis for our conversation today is a continuation of what Alicia just mentioned. The idea that as a community, we invest in our schools in a very important and significant way, but it is not out of proportion with our neighboring districts. It takes a significant amount of money to provide the type of quality education that this community wants and that this community deserves. And so it's important to also realize, as our valuation continues to grow in the current funding scheme, the reality is that we will be asking our taxpayers here in Portland to carry an increasing percentage of that burden. We wish it were otherwise, and we always have the possibility of changes in the state that would change the way that school funding is done. But in the current reality, this chart attempts to show you that over time we project our expenses will continue to increase because we continue to have staff that continue to live in an economy where things continue to go up, and therefore have expectations to receive pay increases in the same way that other people receive pay increases. But we can expect to receive an increasingly smaller and smaller percentage of our total needed funding from the state, and will need to rely on the taxpayers of Portland to be able to maintain the quality of services that we currently provide and need to continue to provide if we're going to meet our goals in the Portland Promise. So, I think many of you have already seen this video. It is our Portland Promise video, one that we've used as part of our launch of the Portland Promise. And I think it speaks eloquently about the tremendous value that the Portland Public Schools have provide today and have provided for generations to people in this community. And so before we end this and turn it over to you to ask questions, I just want to play for you our Portland Promise video.
I had a chance to meet with Senator Mitchell here in Maine at one point, and one of his sayings is that no one should be guaranteed success, but everyone should have an equal chance to succeed. And I feel like that was the embodiment of what Portland Public Schools is all about.
Portland Public Schools taught me to believe in my ability to affect change. So now I can encourage others to believe in themselves. I hope they continue to attract awesome teachers that encourage learning the way that my teachers did, encourage a sense of space and place the way that my teachers did.
I believe in public education. I believe we have to make it better. We have to invest more in it. The experience I had as a kid from elementary school to junior high to high school, it shaped who I am today, 110%.
I feel really fortunate for some of the resources I was able to utilize while at Portland Public Schools, like the access to new computers or after-school programs that helped you focus on subjects or things that you were more interested in.
Portland Public Schools gave me the confidence to be an empowered leader in our community today. The teachers at Portland Public Schools have very much molded me into being what I believe is a very strong, confident female.
Portland Public Schools taught me to challenge the norm, so now I can forge a path that's my own. It was a very supportive community where I had a lot of adult mentors that I could turn to if I wasn't feeling I was challenged enough, and they were able to kind of see what I needed to do and what path I needed to take, even if it was different than what most people were doing.
I felt that I had a support system by some of the teachers that I've gotten close with, and they are responsible for encouraging me and pushing me to do my best, not just at school, but what's outside of school as well.
I realized that, I am good at something. And, it just made me feel better about myself, and it made me motivated to apply to college.
The Portland Public Schools taught me to be resilient so I could be the person that I knew I could be. It's not what you learn, it's the milieu in which you learn it that makes you strong, and that strength and courage helps you to be successful.
Portland Public Schools taught me important life lessons, so now I can deal with adversity in my life.
Portland Public Schools has taught me to be confident in myself so that now I can be a good role model for others.
Portland Public Schools taught me engagement, so now I can engage others in the community.
Portland Public Schools gave me the energy to pursue my passions.
Portland Public Schools taught me two fundamental things: aim high and never, ever give up.
So we started by telling you that great things are happening in the Portland Public Schools, and now you heard from graduates of the Portland Public Schools what the Portland Public Schools have meant to them for generations. And you've also heard today a little bit about what we're facing as a community. Portland is incredibly unique in Maine because of its diversity and because of the commitment to making that diversity central to the narrative of who we are. And I believe that Portland is also unique in this country because there aren't many places like that that combine that diversity and that commitment to diversity that differentiates us from others. So the question before us is whether we as a community are going to stick to those values and those ideals to continue to provide the quality schools that we now have. In the face of our added value, our wealth, we can't expect the state, or I guess we shouldn't expect the state, to save the day. It's up to us to commit to those ideals, and it's up to us to support the work that we're doing to keep that ideal alive. I believe our schools are worth it. I believe that our students are worth it. I believe that this community is worth it. And I believe that Portlanders agree with this vision and will continue to provide the support that has made our Portland Public Schools a great place to learn, a place where great things are happening. So with that, I think we're going to open it up to questions from the public, comments, and look forward to engaging.
I just wanted to ask if you could put in context what conversations and discussions have been happening at the state level to answer the question you just asked.
So at the state level, the MSMA, which is the Maine School Management Association, works aggressively to ensure that sufficient funding is in place for public schools. If you sort of rewind a little bit and look at what we understood was going to happen as a result of the work that was done in the legislature this past spring, you would see that at the time we were projecting that we were going to get anything from $3 to $5 million in additional revenue. Obviously, as you will see, well, it's out there, the ED 279, the form that we get from the state that defines how much money it is that we get every year. We project that we're $3.2 million below what we were last year. And so, and I know that I've shared that information with you. I've shared that information with your colleagues in the Portland delegation. The Portland delegation is incredibly responsive. They're alarmed and I am sure working extremely hard to change that dynamic. But I believe that unless there is a fundamental change in the way in which public schools in Maine are funded, that we're not going to see a reversal of that last graph that you saw that shows that over time as our expenses continue to increase, that the percentage of money that we're going to get from the state to support that is going to continue to decrease. So that engagement with the Portland delegation is only a part of the statewide story, and you're more familiar with the complexities of that conversation than I am, because you live it every day. But I believe the Portland delegation is working really hard to change that $3.2 million gap this year. But I don't think that it's just within the Portland delegation's ability to change fundamentally the way that that school funding happens in Maine, and the fundamental reality that as long as our valuation continues to increase, which in all our economy is strong, we have a great, vibrant city, I don't expect that our valuation would change dramatically, other than in the direction that it's going, which is higher. And in that scenario, given current funding, I don't think that anything is going to change that fundamental assumption that the amount of revenue that we get from the state will be an increasingly smaller percentage of our total budget. And so let me just, because I think you asked specifically in terms of the engagement, I want to thank, obviously, you for being here, for always being our supporter in Augusta, but also Eric Jorgensen sits on the Appropriations Committee. Eric, immediately after the ED 279, he and I were in contact. Dick Farnsworth works extremely closely. He's on the Education Committee, works extremely closely with me on all of these issues. So primarily through Eric and through Dick is the work that we're doing to change the $3.2 million gap this year.
Thank you for doing this presentation today. I had a question about the funding formula that the state uses, and it's been a while since I've paid attention to it. But my recollection is that it's based not only on property valuation, but also enrollment. So that you could say the best case scenario might be that your valuation goes down and your student enrollment goes up. You wouldn't want to see the property values go down. But one thing that might help is that more students join with Portland Public Schools. And I was wondering, particularly with the new comprehensive plan, what efforts have been made to reach families that aren't sending their kids to Portland Public Schools, and then to also prepare those with very young children to think about Portland Public Schools more.
So obviously, we think that the most important thing to do is to be able to create the kind of school system that is attractive to all families. That is what the Portland Promise is all about, and that is fundamentally what we are committed to doing. We have as you know, the community recently supported the rebuilding of 4 elementary schools. We consistently hear from our principals in our older elementary schools that it's difficult to attract families to buildings that are, not comparable to the buildings in many of our surrounding communities. And so that is one of the things that I believe in time will help to increase our catchment. The analysis that we've done on the catchment is that it's been fairly consistent over time. It has not decreased. It has not increased significantly. Our enrollment is fairly steady. Our enrollment this year is slightly higher slightly lower, but slightly higher for EPS purposes because of the averages, or. So we're just basically flat. We're basically flat. So the increase in pre-K is one of the areas that we believe will also help to attract and then retain families in Portland. We currently have 120 students who are in pre-kindergarten programs that are part of the school district. And just this past week, as the board knows, we presented on the results of the study that has been done by the Data Innovation Project under the auspices of Starting Strong, of which we're a partner, to look at what would it look like to have universal pre-kindergarten in Portland. And so over the next 6 months, Assistant Superintendent Nally and her team, as well as our partners in the Starting Strong community, will be putting together a plan to look at universal pre-kindergarten starting with the 2019 school year, working towards that. So that is work that's underway. There's always things that we can do to engage additional parents. We talked just this week about doing focus groups with parents that have started with us and have left us to sort of understand, were there things that we might have done to be able to retain them, particularly when those are parents that have left and moved to a different community or to a private school within our boundaries. And so those are the kinds of things that we need to be able to do to be able to understand what is it that we can do to retain and continue to grow our enrollment. Just as a factoid, because this is just a sort of a blip, the births to families in Portland increased fairly substantially by 10% last year. So those are kids that should be ours 5 years out. So assuming that we realize our Portland Promise goals, I believe that we will have an incredibly attractive school system for those families to enter at that point. So we could be looking at a 10% increase if in our kindergarten class.
Could you just go back over the valuation percentages again? Because you said 2%, and you said it was based on a 2% valuation? And 2 years at what percentage? Yeah, 2 years. Because I've heard this thing about moving from 2 years to 3 years, and I want to understand the impact of doing that kind of a switch. Thanks.
That's okay. So that's a great question, because actually for the FY18 subsidy, there was a 3-year average at the state level. So they were considering 2014, 2015, and 2016 as the state valuation years that we were considering. And obviously, 2014 was 2 years before 2016, so the valuation was lower. So what we did going forward is we were expecting this current year to be 2015, 2016, and 2017, and they actually changed from a 3-year average to a 2-year average. So our lowest year was the one that got dropped off. Now, throughout the state, everyone's lowest year, for the most part, was the one that got dropped off. So we were hoping that it was going to even out a bit, but I can tell you, because I've looked at all the valuations, Portland was the highest. So we had the highest shift because of that decision. Had they done 2014 or 2015, 2016, and 2017, our total valuation would have been about $150 million lower than it was. So that, for us, was a big game changer in why we ended up receiving less money than we thought we were going to.
Just talk briefly about this.
So the question that we just asked, can you tell us about tuition? So one thing that's different in this year, well, not this year, it's been a few years now, but if there's something called a superintendent agreement, we don't receive tuition from other districts. Their student is counted in our EPS formula. So if you looked at our budget 4 or 5 years ago, you'd see our tuition revenue was much higher, because that's how we were getting credit for those students. That district was sending money to Portland. So that's not the way it works anymore. Now those students are counted in our state formula, and we receive funding that way. So tuition over time has gone down anyway. The other tuition that we receive are, there are some parents in other communities that think the value of Portland Public Schools is so strong that they tuition their kids here. So we do have a tuition in our budget of probably around $200,000, I'd say. So again, very small piece of the pie. In the current year's budget, there's a larger tuition line. It's about $1.8 million, which is how that 2% got made up. So all in all, that other revenue source is about $2 million. So in the current year, that's all called sending schools tuition. So for paths that we're standing in Paths in Casco Bay right now, the districts that send their students here pay us a percentage of the total budget. So last year that was $1.8 million. However, part of the reason why the formula changed so much this year for 2019 is that the state has given us 100% of the budget for paths. So there's no longer a CTE allocation for all schools that have students in CTE, so that's career and technical education for everyone at home. And so, for example, RSU 14, Wyndham Raymond, they would receive money in their 8279 for CTE, and they would pay that to Portland Public Schools because they send students here. Because that's not happening anymore, and we received all $3 million in our current year state subsidy that we're going to see in our upcoming budget, we're no longer able to bill for tuition for those kids. So we're going to not only see a drop in our state funding, because even though we got that $3 million of a bump, our valuation sort of wiped it out. So all in all, we're really seeing a loss of $1.8 million in our total revenue because we're not billing that tuition anymore. So from last year's budget, you're going to see, 2% of those revenue sources, and in this year, it's going to be almost non-existent because we're not going to be able to include that anymore. So, the thing about the city is they have the ability to raise all kinds of revenues, and for the most part, that offsets any increases that they're going to have in their budget. But for us, there's no way to diversify that revenue source. So when we get a whole revenue source taken away, it sort of expands the problem even more, is now we only have state subsidy and local sort of valuation that's propping us up. So it is a problem. So tuition is unfortunately becoming sort of a non-issue any longer.
All right. Chair Seeliger, do you want to close us out?
All right. Well, thank you very much, Superintendent Botana, for putting together the Funding for Our Futures presentation for our first Portland Board of Education Public Affairs Community Forum. We're hoping to do several more throughout the school year. And thanks to Tim for coming up with the idea of streaming it. So hopefully we have some people posting and commenting and some more people getting involved with our next community forum, and we will be publishing that and promoting that. And thanks to Grace Venezuela for the promotion and getting this first meeting of the year started. So thank you everyone for showing up on a Saturday.